If she could mock our marriage in front of everyone, why did she freeze when I smiled, handed her already signed divorce papers, and watched her eyes search the room for help? Like the real secret wasn't the joke, but who was standing behind it? My name is Evan Hart, and I have learned that humiliation is not always loud, because sometimes it wears a smile and waits for the room to clap. The company party was one of those nights where the lighting makes everyone look like a better version of themselves, and the music is chosen so nobody has to sit with their own thoughts for too long. The venue was polished in that modern, expensive way that pretends it is casual, with high ceilings that swallow embarrassment, and glass walls that reflect your face back at you like a quiet warning. I stood there with a drink I barely tasted, watching my co-workers perform their yearly ritual of pretending we were all friends, while the same people who scheduled each other into meetings all week leaned in close and called it connection. My wife loved this kind of room because it gave her what she always wanted, which was a stage without any responsibility for the script. Lila arrived late enough to make an entrance and early enough to avoid suspicion, and she did it with the same practiced ease she used when she wanted something and did not want to admit it. She kissed my cheek like a signature on a document, light and quick, and then she drifted toward the cluster of people who mattered more to her than anyone who shared a home with her. I did not chase, and I did not sulk, because I had stopped reacting like that months ago, when I realized reaction is the only currency some people ever spend. I watched her laugh at something someone said, and her laugh had that slightly forced brightness that says she is paying attention to who is watching rather than what is being said. She looked perfect, which is how you know the night is going to get ugly, because perfection never comes without a bill. The first sign was the way she kept checking the room, not in a nervous way, but in a scanning way, like she was confirming that the right witnesses were present. I know that look, because I work around people who care about records, timing, and what can be proven later, and I have spent years learning how to see the difference between someone living a moment and someone managing it. I noticed how she angled her body when she spoke to certain colleagues, and how she kept her phone face down on the table as if the screen might betray her. I noticed how she avoided standing too close to me when photos were taken, and how she laughed a fraction too hard when someone made a joke about marriage, as if she had been rehearsing a response and was grateful for the opening. I noticed everything, because that is what you do when you are already halfway out the door, even if nobody else knows it yet. The party rolled on the way these things always do, with forced cheer and shallow compliments, and then someone called for a toast because no corporate event is complete until someone pretends it is a family. People gathered in a loose semicircle, drinks raised like little shields, and the person speaking said the expected words about teamwork, success, and the future, which is corporate code for keep working and do not ask for too much. Lila squeezed in near the center, close enough to be seen, and when the toast ended, the crowd loosened, the laughter restarted, and the room tried to pretend it was not hungry for drama. That was when she did it, right when the energy was high and the attention was still gathered, like she wanted the impact to land on as many ears as possible. She lifted her glass and said with a grin that suggested she was being brave, rather than cruel, that she needed a new marriage, because this one was trash. It was meant to sound like a joke, the kind of line people repeat later while smiling, because it is easier to laugh than to admit you witnessed something rotten. A few people chuckled because they did not know what else to do, and a few people looked away because they did not want to be seen seeing it. The room waited for me to play my part, because a public insult is not complete until the target reacts, and the crowd can decide who won. I smiled, because I had already decided that my reaction would not be the entertainment. I stepped closer, not aggressive, not theatrical, just close enough that she could not pretend I did not hear. I told her I was glad we finally agreed on something, and then I pulled out the divorce papers that were already signed on my side, folded neatly as if they were a receipt for a purchase I regretted. I handed them to her the way you hand someone a door key after you change the locks, calm, and final. The shift in her face was small, but it was there, like a crack in glass that only shows at the right angle, and for a second she forgot she was performing. Her eyes flicked across the room, searching for a lifeline, a protector, a friend with authority, someone who could rewrite what just happened. People stopped laughing, and the quiet that followed was cleaner than any speech. The toast glasses lowered, and the smiles became uncertain, because the crowd realized they were no longer watching a couple's banter, but a decision. Lila held the papers like they were too heavy, and she tried to hold her grin in place, but it would not stay. She opened her mouth as if she wanted to say something, but she did not, because nothing she could say would make the scene feel like a joke again. I did not wait for her to recover, because waiting would have given her time to turn it back into her story, and I was done being a character in her version of events. I walked away from the semicircle of faces, and the strange thing about leaving a room like that is how many people suddenly want to catch your eye. They want reassurance that they do not have to pick a side, that they can go back to drinking and pretending they did not witness a fracture. A coworker I barely liked touched my arm like we were friends, and his expression suggested he wanted to tell me I deserved better, but he did not want to be on record saying it. Someone else laughed awkwardly and said something about rough jokes, trying to smooth the air, and I gave him the kind of look that makes men stop talking without understanding why. I did not raise my voice, and I did not look for sympathy, because I had learned that sympathy is a cheap substitute for respect, and I wanted neither. Outside, the night air felt sharper, like it had teeth, and the city noise sounded honest compared to the polished lies inside. I stood near the curb and watched the valet line, watching strangers hand over their keys with trust, and I felt the bitter humor of it settle in my chest. I had trusted my wife with more than keys, and she had treated it like a prop. I checked my phone, not because I was desperate for messages, but because I wanted to mark the time, and I wanted my own memory anchored in something that would not shift later. It was a habit from my work, a small private discipline, because disciplined people survive better when stories start moving. On the ride home, I replayed the moment not with pain, but with precision. I remembered her tone, the exact timing, the way she chose the moment right after the toast, when everyone's attention was still gathered like a spotlight she could step into. I remembered who laughed first and who looked away, and I remembered how her eyes searched the room for help. That search was the part that mattered most, because it told me what she believed about power, and it told me she expected someone else to protect her from consequences. That meant she had already built a safety net, and safety nets are not built in one night. When I walked into our house, the silence felt staged, like someone had been practicing it. The lights were off in the living room, and the air carried the faint smell of her perfume mixed with the clean scent of laundry detergent, an ordinary domestic blend that suddenly felt like a lie. I set my keys down with care, because anger makes people clumsy, and clumsiness is how you lose details. I stood in the kitchen and looked at the small marks of our shared life, a mug on the counter, a grocery list stuck to the fridge, a sweater draped over a chair like it belonged to someone who would be back soon. It would have been easy to turn that into a tragedy, but I did not do tragedies, because tragedies make villains look like heroes, and my wife already loved playing the hero. I had signed the papers days earlier, not because I enjoyed planning a public moment, but because the marriage had been breaking in quiet ways for a long time. It had cracked at the edges, where nobody looks, in small dismissals, in late nights that came with vague explanations, in conversations where she listened with her eyes rather than her mind. Signing was not a threat. It was an exit strategy, a clean line on paper, because paper does not get gaslit. I had not told her, because telling her would have turned it into negotiation, and I was done negotiating my dignity with someone who treated it like a joke. She came home later than I did, and I heard her heels on the entryway tile, a sharp rhythm that sounded like confidence trying to convince itself. She walked into the kitchen and looked at me like she was deciding which version of herself to use: the sweet one, the angry one, the wounded one, the amused one, and I could see the calculation behind her eyes. She held the papers in her hand, now unfolded, and she tried to speak like this was a misunderstanding, like she had not done it in front of witnesses. She tried to reframe it as a joke that landed wrong, and she tried to make me the one who overreacted, because that is the oldest trick in the book, and she loved old tricks because they usually worked. I did not argue, because arguments are a ladder, and she always climbed them better than I did. I stayed calm and asked her to explain why she needed a new marriage, because if she believed it enough to announce it, she should be able to say it in a quiet kitchen. She gave me the kind of answer that sounds reasonable until you examine it. A vague stew of dissatisfaction, pressure, and feeling unseen. All the classic phrases that can mean anything, and therefore mean nothing. She spoke like she had rehearsed, and I noticed that her wording had a strange polish, as if it had been coached to avoid admitting fault. There it was again, the script, the same rhythm I had seen at the party, and my suspicion tightened into something sharper than hurt. I went to bed without closing anything, because closure is what people demand when they want the story to end before the truth is fully visible. In the dark, I listened to the house settle, the quiet pops of wood and distant plumbing, and I thought about what I had seen in her eyes when she searched the room for help. I thought about who, in that room, would have been able to protect her, and one name kept circling back like a predator in slow water. Grant Morrow, the corporate HR chief, a man who could ruin careers with a meeting invite and a smile that never reached his eyes. I had watched him for years, watched how people lowered their voices when he approached, watched how he turned policies into weapons without ever looking like the one holding the blade. If Lila believed she could humiliate me publicly, it meant she believed she had leverage. If she believed she had leverage, it meant she believed someone would catch her if she fell. That is what people do when they are preparing to jump. They make sure there is a net, and they do not build that net alone. I lay there and counted the small facts I already had, not proof yet, but signals, the kind that lead you to proof if you are patient. Her late arrival, her scanning gaze, her phone face down, her rehearsed phrases, her search for help, and the way Grant watched without intervening, as if he already knew how the night would go. Morning came with the dull gray light that makes everything look honest and tired. I made coffee and stared at the steam rising, because steam is what happens when something hot meets cold air, and our house had been full of that kind of collision for months. Lila acted normal, because normal is her favorite disguise, and she moved around the kitchen like the night before had been a messy joke that would disappear if we both pretended hard enough. She mentioned errands, work, deadlines, and she spoke with a forced lightness that sounded like she was offering me a truce. But it was not a truce. It was a reset. And resets are how people erase evidence. When she left, I did not follow, because chasing makes you look desperate, and I was done handing her that advantage. Instead, I did what I always do when a story starts shifting, which is anchor myself to something that will not change. I pulled a notepad from a drawer and wrote the date, the time, and a plain description of what happened at the party, as if I were recording a fact for a file. I wrote it without emotion, because emotion is a liability when you need to be believed. I wrote down her exact words as best I could remember, and I wrote down my response, and I wrote down who was near enough to hear, because witnesses matter even when nobody wants to be one. Then I opened a folder on my phone, not a secret spy folder, just a plain place where I could keep screenshots, receipts, and notes, because my life was about to become a timeline whether I wanted it or not. I did not plan revenge the way dramatic people plan revenge, with threats and theatrics and late-night fantasies, because theatrics make you sloppy. I planned it the way careful people plan anything, with small lawful steps, with patience, and with the understanding that the truth does not need a megaphone when you hand it to the right room. My method has always been death by 1,000 truths, and Lila had just given me the first one in front of everyone. By noon, I understood something else, something that made my stomach tighten in a way that had nothing to do with heartbreak. The party insult was not a spontaneous joke, and it was not a drunken slip, because she had been sober enough to choose her moment and scan for witnesses. It was a test, and it was a message, and the message was that she believed she could rewrite our marriage publicly and walk away clean. The mistake she made was assuming I would fight for her, because she had not yet realized that my calm was not surrender, and my silence was not confusion. It was preparation. That night, when I looked at the signed divorce papers again, I did not feel triumph, because there is nothing triumphant about a marriage collapsing, even when you were the one who saw it coming. What I felt was clarity, and clarity is dangerous, because it removes the fog that lets people lie to themselves. Lila thought the worst thing she could do was embarrass me in a room full of coworkers. She did not understand that embarrassment fades, but records remain, and I was about to become the man who turned her performance into a file the world could not ignore. The only question left was who she thought she was jumping toward, and why she had been so sure there would be hands waiting to catch her. The next 2 days moved with a strange kind of speed, because once a public moment happens, private life stops pretending it is private. Lila kept acting as if the party had been an awkward misunderstanding, but her version of normal had little seams in it, like a dress stitched in a hurry. She laughed too brightly at nothing. She stayed busy in rooms where I was not, and she used her phone the way gamblers use cards, close to the chest, and always ready to hide. When she spoke to me, she spoke as if she was talking to a witness rather than a husband, and that told me she was already thinking about how the story would sound later. I had lived with her long enough to know that she only talks like that when she believes she might have to defend herself to someone with power. I did not ask where she was going or who she was texting, because those questions do not get answers, they get rehearsals. Instead, I watched the small details that people forget to manage, the ones that fall out of their pockets when they are focused on the big lie. I watched the times she left and the times she returned, and I watched how she picked her excuses like someone choosing a tie, something that matched the room she expected to walk into. She told me she had a late mentoring session, then she said a vendor meeting ran long, then she claimed she had to help a friend with a quick errand, and none of it sounded impossible. That was the point, because a cover story does not have to be impressive. It only has to be plausible enough that nobody asks a second question. Lila's mistake was believing that plausibility is the same as consistency. On the third evening, she came home with a soft energy that was supposed to read as guilt, but it read to me as performance. She moved around the kitchen, making a show of being domestic, touching things like she was proving she still belonged here. She asked me about my day, and she listened with her eyes again, tracking whether I sounded angry, whether I sounded weak, whether I sounded like a man still hoping. I gave her steady answers, not cold, not warm, just flat enough that she could not hook a reaction. She hated that, because she could not tell if I was waiting, and uncertainty makes controlling people desperate. After dinner, she left her phone on the counter for the first time in days, face down as usual, but not fully hidden. She moved toward the laundry room with a basket, and she glanced back as if she expected to see me grab it. That glance was not casual, it was bait, and it meant she wanted to confirm something about me. Maybe she wanted to see if I would invade her privacy, so she could later accuse me of being controlling, or maybe she wanted to reassure herself that she still had the upper hand. I did not touch the phone, because touching it would have been a confession of insecurity, and I was not going to give her that gift. Then the screen lit up by itself, bright in the dim kitchen, and a lock screen preview flashed across it for a second before it dimmed again. I did not need to pick it up to see what it was, because the light fell across the counter like a small spotlight, and the text was large enough to read at a glance. It was a notification from a social app, the kind of alert that shows you a piece of the world without asking permission. It referenced a tagged story, and the timestamp under it told me it was fresh, minutes old, not an old memory resurfacing by chance. My heart did not race, because I had already accepted the truth in my bones, but something colder moved inside me, a quiet confirmation that my instincts had not been paranoid. I waited until she was out of the room because I was not looking for a fight, I was looking for proof that could survive her denials. I picked up my own phone, not hers, and I opened the app, searching for the public tag the way anyone could. I found it quickly, because people who think they are untouchable get careless, and people who want attention always want witnesses. The story was posted by someone I recognized from her work circle, and it showed a group of them in a place that was not the office and not a normal team dinner. The lighting was warm and staged, the kind of lighting venues use to make everybody look like they belong there. Lila was in the frame for only a moment, laughing, leaning in towards someone just outside the crop, and the angle was wrong in a way that made it feel intimate. I did not zoom in like a jealous man hunting for pain, because pain was not the point anymore. The point was the date stamp, the tag, and the fact that she was somewhere she had not mentioned. I took a screenshot that captured the tag and the date, and I made sure the time was visible on my screen when I saved it, because later she would claim it was old, or edited, or misunderstood. I saved it twice, once in my regular camera roll, and once in the plain evidence folder I had already created, because redundancy is what separates memory from documentation. Then I took one more screenshot showing the profile that posted it, because if the story vanished, the source would still matter. When she came back into the kitchen, I was already sitting with my coffee like nothing had happened. She glanced at the counter, and she noticed her phone's position had shifted by a few millimeters, and her eyes narrowed for a fraction of a second. She tried to hide the reaction, but I caught it, because people can control their mouths better than they can control their pupils. She asked if I had seen a message come in, and she tried to make it sound like she was only curious. I told her I had not noticed anything, and I said it in the same flat tone I had been using all week. She watched my face, waiting for a crack, and when she did not find one, she picked up her phone and slipped it into her pocket as if it had never existed. Later, when we were in the living room, she tested a different angle. She told me she might have to go in early the next morning because of a sudden HR issue, and she said Grant's name casually, like she was dropping it to see if it changed my expression. I kept my face still because Grant's name already meant something to me, and I refused to let her know how much. She described it like a simple compliance task, a meeting that ran long, a minor situation she had to help manage, and she made it sound boring on purpose. People lie best when they aim for boredom, because boredom makes listeners stop paying attention. I nodded as if I believed her, and she relaxed slightly, because she thought her story had landed. After she went to bed, I sat alone at the kitchen table and looked at the screenshots again, not with rage, but with a clerk's focus. I checked the date stamp, the tag, and the handle that posted it. I noted the location markers that were visible, because the venue had its own branding in the corner of the story, like a watermark, the kind of thing businesses love because it turns customers into advertisers. I wrote the venue name on my notepad and circled it once, because that name might show up later in a receipt trail or a merchant alert. I did not imagine myself storming into the venue to confront anyone, because confrontations are a gift to liars. A liar loves a confrontation, because a confrontation gives them emotion to point at, and they can say the emotion was the problem, not their actions. The next morning, Lila left early, moving with quiet purpose, and she dressed with more care than her schedule demanded. She kissed my cheek again, lighter than before, and she told me she might not have service in the building where she would be. That line was too specific, too preemptive, and it lodged in my mind like a splinter. People mention bad service when they want you to accept silence later, and she was already laying groundwork for disappearing. I watched her walk to her car, and I noticed she did not look back, not once, which told me she was not worried about my feelings. She was worried about something else, something ahead of her, something that required her full attention. I waited an hour, then I did something small that changed the shape of everything. I opened our shared calendar, the one we both used for ordinary life, appointments, errands, and the occasional dinner with family. I did not dig into private accounts or hidden folders because I did not need to, and I would not cross that line even if I wanted to. I looked at the week view, scanning for the events she had mentioned, and I found what I expected, which was a neat pattern of vague blocks labeled in broad terms. Then I compared those blocks to the story timestamp I had captured, and the overlap was subtle but real, the kind of conflict that only matters if you care about truth. I did not export the calendar yet, because I was not ready to show my hand, and exporting too early can make you feel like you have won when you have only started. Instead, I took a screenshot of the calendar conflict header, the part that shows date and time clearly, and I saved it into the same folder. I noted the contradiction in my notepad with a clean sentence, because later, when she tried to confuse me with emotion, I wanted a record that spoke in facts. Then I closed everything, washed my cup, and went about my day as if I had not just picked up a thread that could unravel her entire story. By that evening, the story tag was gone, which did not surprise me, because people like Lila never leave a loose end once they sense danger. She acted more affectionate, not because she loved me, but because affection is another kind of control, and she wanted to pull me back into the old pattern. She made dinner. She asked about my plans. She joked about small things like we were normal again, and she watched me for signs of softness. I gave her politeness, because politeness costs me nothing, and I gave her nothing else, because she had already spent my trust. While she talked, I listened for the scripted phrases again, and I heard them, the same smooth wording, the same careful framing, and I realized the first twist was already forming in my mind. This was not just an affair hidden behind random excuses, because random people do not rehearse like that. This was an operation with coaching, with a narrative designed to make me look unreasonable if I ever pushed back. The lover, whoever he was only one piece, and the real danger was the person who could shape the official story inside her workplace. I went to bed with that thought sitting heavy in my chest, and I understood that the divorce papers were not the end of anything. They were the beginning of a 30-day collapse, and I had just collected the first proof that could survive her smile. By the time the third day after the party arrived, the office had already digested the scene and turned it into a snack-sized rumor. People do not carry the full truth because it is heavy and sharp, so they file it down into something they can repeat in hallways without choking. The version they repeated was that my wife had a dark sense of humor and I had finally snapped, which was comforting to them because it meant they did not have to consider that cruelty can be casual and consequences can be quiet. I listened to the fragments without correcting anyone, because correcting is a kind of begging, and I was not begging for an accurate story from people who liked the inaccurate one better. I spent that morning moving through routine like a man who had not slept, because routine is camouflage, and camouflage buys time. I answered emails, I nodded at small talk, and I watched who watched me, because after a public humiliation, people develop a new hobby, which is studying the target to see if he will bleed again. Lila had not messaged me once with anything that sounded like regret, only logistical notes and a forced normalcy that made my skin itch. She was trying to reset the board, wipe the slate, and pretend the party was a glitch, not a reveal. That reset effort told me she was afraid of what I might do with memory, because memory is dangerous when it becomes documentation. Near midday, my phone buzzed with a merchant alert from an account that was mine, not shared, not hidden, just mine. It was not a large charge, not the kind that would set off any responsible alarm, because it was the kind of amount people spend when they want deniability. The merchant name, though, hit my eye in a way that made the air feel colder. It matched the venue name I had written down the night before from the story watermark, the one I had circled once in my notepad like it was a suspect's name. The timing lined up within the same week, close enough to be meaningful, far enough apart to show pattern. I did not need to imagine anything dramatic, because the simplest explanation already tasted like betrayal. I sat at my desk and looked at the alert again, making sure I read it right, because clarity matters when you are building something that has to survive other people's skepticism. The merchant name, the date, and the amount all sat there with the blunt honesty that only financial systems can manage. It did not prove an affair by itself, but it proved contact with a place that was already connected to her. It proved my money had been involved in her private performance, and that detail mattered, because people forgive cheating more easily than they forgive being used. If this ended up being a story told in public, the receipt trail would not sound like jealousy. It would sound like fraud of the heart, and fraud always makes crowds colder. I did not call the bank, and I did not freeze anything, and I did not launch into threats, because panic is what liars want from you. Panic makes you impulsive, and impulsive men make mistakes that powerful people can file into HR reports. Instead, I did what I always do when something smells wrong, which is verify quietly using lawful friction, the kind no one can accuse you of manufacturing. The merchant in the alert was a restaurant, and restaurants are public machines that run on documented transactions and bored staff who remember more than they should. I decided to go there that evening, not to chase my wife like a wounded dog, but to confirm a time, a place, and a payment trail that belonged to me. The restaurant was new enough to still have pride in its own name, which meant the branding was everywhere. The sign outside glowed with that carefully designed confidence that says, "This place expects to be photographed," and inside the atmosphere felt curated. Warm lighting, clean lines, music that never rises enough to make conversation honest. I walked in alone, dressed like a man who belonged there, because belonging makes people less suspicious, and suspicion is how doors close. I did not look around like a detective in a cheap movie, because that is how you announce your intentions. I moved like a customer, which is what I was, and also what I needed to be to get what I came for. I ordered something simple and sat where I could see the bar and the host stand without looking like I was watching them. The place was busy in that early success way, a mix of first-time visitors and regulars who wanted to become regulars before the place got too popular. Staff moved fast, smiling with the strained politeness of people who are being judged by online reviews. A manager drifted between tables, checking on guests like a politician kissing babies. I waited, because waiting is a kind of power when you are not desperate, and I was not desperate, I was methodical. After I ate, I approached the cashier area with the calm of a man solving a small, boring problem. I explained that I had received a merchant alert and wanted to confirm a transaction time for my own records, because sometimes receipts do not save properly in a wallet. I did not mention my wife, and I did not mention suspicion, and I did not mention anything emotional, because emotion makes staff defensive. I made it about accuracy, and accuracy is something businesses understand. The cashier listened, glanced at the system, and told me they could print a receipt copy if I could confirm the last 4 digits and the amount. I confirmed what I needed to confirm, and the printer spit out a narrow slip of paper that felt heavier than it should. The receipt copy had the time printed clearly, and the date matched the alert. It also included a table number and a server code, which I did not even need, but my eyes registered anyway, because details pile up and become weight later. I thanked the cashier, folded the slip, and tucked it into my pocket like it was nothing. Then outside, I unfolded it again under the streetlight and looked at the time with the same attention you give a signature when you know it will matter in court. The time overlapped with one of the vague calendar blocks Lila had labeled as work, and now I had 2 independent facts pointing at the same lie, one from a calendar and one from a transaction. I took out my phone and photographed the receipt copy with the timestamp visible, making sure the lighting was good enough that no one could later claim it was unreadable. I did it quickly, without drama, because drama attracts attention, and attention brings questions. Then I saved the photo into the evidence folder and wrote a single clean line into my notepad, stating the date, the time, and the venue name. It was not romance, not heartbreak, not revenge, just accounting. And accounting is what kills lies, because lies need fog to breathe. I was sliding the receipt back into my pocket when I saw Grant Morrow inside the restaurant, near the bar, talking to someone with the casual authority of a man who believes he owns the atmosphere. He stood the way HR executives stand, relaxed but positioned, his body angled so he could see the room without looking like he was scanning it. He was dressed in the uniform of tasteful power, nothing flashy, nothing memorable, because men like him prefer to be unavoidable rather than noticed. I had not expected to see him there, and that surprise was useful because surprises reveal reflexes, and reflexes tell the truth faster than planned words. I walked back inside with the receipt already secured and my face already neutral. Grant's eyes found me, because he was the kind of man who always tracks who enters a room, and when he saw me, his smile appeared like a switch being flipped. He approached with the smooth friendliness that HR uses when it needs to look harmless. He asked how I was doing after the party, with a tone that suggested concern, but the concern was for his own risk, not my well-being. He made a small comment about how these events can get emotional, and he framed it like he was offering me a chance to regain dignity by pretending it was all mutual misunderstanding. I kept my voice steady and my posture relaxed, because if I looked tense, he could later describe me as unstable, and his descriptions carry weight. I responded with polite minimalism, and I did not mention my wife or the divorce papers or the story tag. I made it about work and schedules and the kind of neutral small talk that gives nothing away. Grant kept his smile, but his eyes sharpened slightly because he was trying to find out what I knew. He asked if Lila was doing okay, and he said it like a colleague checking on a coworker, but the question was too loaded to be casual. I told him she seemed busy, and I left it there. Then he made his mistake, the kind that happens when someone believes the script is working. He mentioned, in an offhand way, that the party venue staff had been annoyed about last-minute changes on the guest list, and he added that Lila had handled it well, which was strange because I had not said anything about guest lists or staff or last-minute changes. The detail was specific, and it was the kind of detail you only know if you were close to the situation, not just a distant observer. It told me he had been paying attention to her movements and her image management, and it told me he was invested enough to know the small friction points that she thought no one would notice. I did not call him out, because calling him out would have warned him, and warning him would have made my next steps harder. Instead, I let the moment hang for a half-second longer than normal, just enough that he could feel the air shift. His smile tightened, and he tried to smooth it over by talking about policy, boundaries, and workplace harmony, the usual HR incense used to cover the smell of fear. I nodded, as if I respected his professionalism, and I said nothing that could be used against me. In my mind, though, the shape of the game changed, because now I had proof that Grant was not just watching this from a distance. He was in the orbit, and he was talking like a man who expected to control the narrative. I left the restaurant a few minutes later with the receipt copy still warm in my pocket and a new kind of clarity in my chest. The affair, if that was what it was not a messy secret between two reckless people. It was sheltered by someone who understood records, meetings, and reputations, someone who could make a lie official if it went unchallenged. I walked to my car and sat for a moment, letting the city noise fill the silence, because silence is where plans become real. I looked at the receipt photo again, then at the calendar screenshot, and I could see how the pieces might fit, not with certainty yet, but with enough structure to move forward. When I got home, Lila was already there, and she greeted me with the same careful softness she had been using, like she believed affection could erase documentation. She asked about my day, and she watched my face for signs of confrontation. I gave her a calm answer and then asked a simple question about her schedule, phrased like normal curiosity, not accusation. She answered smoothly, too smoothly, and she used one of the same polished phrases she had used before, as if she had been coached to keep her wording consistent. I did not correct her, and I did not challenge her, because challenging her would have given her the chance to evolve the lie. I let her speak, and I let her commit to the script again. Later, alone in the kitchen, I opened my evidence folder and looked at the sequence of images. The story tag with the date stamp, the calendar conflict header, and now the receipt copy with a printed time, each one simple, each one lawful, each one indifferent to emotion. I added a new line to my notepad, describing the restaurant transaction confirmation, and the moment Grant mentioned details he should not have known. I kept it clean and factual, because if I was going to win, I would win by being boringly accurate. I would not win by yelling, and I would not win by begging for explanations from a woman who had already joked about replacing me. I went to bed with the receipt slip tucked into a folder like a small blade, and I understood that my wife's humiliation at the party had not been the climax. It had been the opening move of a larger play, one where she believed the right people would protect her from consequences. Now I had proof that her world and Grant's world overlapped in ways that were not accidental, and that realization tightened my focus into something sharp. The next time Grant tried to frame me as the problem, I would not argue, and I would not plead. I would hand the room another small truth, and I would watch the scaffolding start to crack. The next morning felt like the office had turned into a courtroom without walls, because every hallway glance carried a verdict and every polite smile carried a question. I walked in with the same steady pace I always used, because changing your pace is how people know you are rattled, and I refused to give them that easy read. The party story had already been reduced to a simple meme in people's minds, with my wife as the bold comedian and me as the stiff man who could not take a joke. That framing was convenient for them, because it let them laugh without guilt and gossip without responsibility. I understood that if I tried to correct them directly, I would only feed the narrative that I was emotional and fragile, which is exactly the kind of label a man like Grant could weaponize later. I kept my face neutral and my voice even through every forced conversation, because neutrality is a shield that does not look like a shield. A few co-workers approached me with careful concern, the kind people show when they want to appear kind without actually taking a risk. They asked if I was okay, and they did it with eyes that searched for a crack, because people are addicted to watching other people break. I told them I was fine, and I said it in a way that ended the topic, because every extra word becomes material. I noticed how quickly the conversations moved away from me once they realized I would not perform pain for them. I also noticed who avoided me entirely, because avoidance is its own confession, and it told me which people had already chosen the safer side. By midday, my phone delivered another quiet confirmation, this time in the form of a second merchant alert that matched the same cluster of places near that restaurant district. The amount was small again, and the name was different, but the location pattern was consistent enough to feel like a footprint rather than a coincidence. I did not assume the worst immediately, because assumptions make you careless, and I needed to stay factual. Still, the timing had the same scent of her vague calendar blocks, and the coincidence was starting to look like a routine. I opened my notes and listed the alert details in plain language, with dates and amounts, and I did it like a man tracking expenses, not like a man tracking betrayal. That distinction mattered, because the story I needed to build had to stand even if someone tried to paint me as paranoid. I kept every step lawful and simple, because the moment I acted like a spy, I would become the villain in Grant's favorite kind of report. I did not touch her phone, and I did not pry into private accounts, and I did not ask anyone for secret favors. I used only what was already in my hand, which was my own account notifications, public posts, and shared household tools. Those are boring sources, And boring sources are powerful because nobody can claim they were fabricated by obsession. The more boring I stayed, the harder it would be to dismiss me as unstable. I could already see the shape of the trap Grant might set for me, and I refused to step into it. That afternoon, I met Nolan Pierce for coffee, because Nolan was one of the few people in that building who respected documentation more than social comfort. He worked in finance administration, which meant he lived in a world where numbers do not care about charm and timelines do not care about excuses. I did not tell him I was building a case because the word case makes people nervous and nervous people leak. I told him I was separating my life carefully and wanted to avoid any mistakes, and I asked him a few plain questions about how the company handled certain complaints when personal conduct collided with policy. Nolan listened, looked around once as if the walls could hear, and then gave me the simple truth, which was that HR loves anything that lets them control the story early. Nolan did not warn me with dramatic language, but his caution was clear. He explained that if Grant decided to frame this as a disruptive personal conflict spilling into the workplace, Grant could turn my calm into suspicion and my silence into risk. He explained that HR uses neutral words to sharpen the blade, words like concern, pattern, and escalation. He explained that once a label lands in an internal record, it becomes a lens, and everything you do afterward is viewed through it. I thanked him, because I already knew most of that, but hearing it from another mouth made it solid. Before we left, Nolan advised me to keep my communications clean, keep my tone even, and never react in a way that could be described as threatening or erratic. I told him that was not a problem because I had no intention of giving Grant a story he could sell. When I returned home that evening, Lila was waiting in the kitchen with the kind of energy that tries to look casual while measuring you. She asked about my day and offered small domestic gestures, like she wanted to prove she was still the same wife and I was still the same husband. I accepted the gestures without warmth and without rejection, because both warmth and rejection are emotional gifts. She watched me carefully while she spoke, and she kept adjusting her wording as if she was looking for the phrase that would unlock me. It was not just what she said that bothered me. It was how consistent her phrasing stayed across different topics. The same neat structures kept appearing, the same soft disclaimers, the same careful framing that pushed responsibility into the air like smoke. It sounded coached, and I began to believe that her story was not only hers. I did not confront her directly, because direct confrontation would have allowed her to adapt. Instead, I asked small factual questions, the kind that sound harmless but have sharp edges. I asked what time she thought she would be home on certain days, and I asked it like I was planning dinner, not like I was building a timeline. She answered quickly and confidently, then corrected herself a second later, then returned to the first answer again, and that subtle wobble gave me what I needed. Liars can memorize a script, but they cannot always keep it aligned with reality when reality is asked in small pieces. I nodded, and I let her commit to the version she preferred, because commitment is what makes later contradictions meaningful. After she went to bed, I laid my proof out on the dining table like a dull puzzle that still cut fingers. I printed one screenshot, because print makes things feel real to rooms that distrust screens. I stapled the receipt copy into a page protector sleeve, because sleeves keep paper clean and keep emotions out. I wrote a simple evidence ledger on paper, one page only, listing each item with a date and a source, and I signed the bottom as if I were certifying my own sanity. It was not theatrical, and it was not clever, and that was exactly why it worked. If someone tried to accuse me of obsessing, I could show them a single page that looked like accounting, not vengeance. I kept the ledger minimal because clutter is how you lose credibility. I listed the tagged story screenshot with its date stamp, the calendar conflict header from the shared week view, and the receipt confirmation with the printed time. I added the merchant alerts as supporting context, not as proof of betrayal by themselves, because I was not building a story for myself. I was building a record for other people. Other people need steps, not feelings. Other people need clear dates, not declarations. I looked at the page and saw that the picture was becoming readable, even to someone who did not care about my marriage, and that was the point. Still, something about the situation bothered me beyond the usual pain, and it bothered me because it felt organized. Lila had insulted me publicly with a confidence that suggested she expected protection. She had spoken in phrases that sounded like they were designed to withstand scrutiny. She had shown no panic when her alibi wobbled at dinner conversation, as if she believed the details did not matter because someone else could smooth them. That kind of confidence does not come from love, and it does not come from lust. It comes from leverage, and leverage comes from institutions, and the institution closest to her at work was Grant. I began to test a new hypothesis in my mind, and the hypothesis was that I was not the main problem they were solving. I was the variable they were managing. If Lila was involved with someone, the affair might be personal, but the protection felt professional. That meant the lover could be connected to policy, access, and reputation, not just attraction. It also meant that the attack on me might be preemptive, a way to label me before I could label them. That is what powerful people do when they sense risk. They smear the messenger before the message arrives. I knew that game, and I had no interest in playing it with emotion. The pressure started to leak into my wider life because personal problems always try to become community entertainment. Ruth, my mother, called and asked how I was holding up, and her tone told me she had already heard a version of the party story from someone who enjoyed it. She did not accuse me, but she asked questions in the careful way she uses when she is trying to separate truth from theater. I told her the facts without decoration, and I told her that I would handle things quietly. Ruth did not offer advice, because she knows I do not take advice when my mind is set, but she warned me that family dinners were coming, and that Lila would likely try to pre-frame the story as a harmless joke and my response as cruel. Ruth said it without anger, and that calm warning landed harder than any shouting would. The mention of family dinners tightened my focus again, because family is where reputations either heal or rot. If Lila could get my relatives to see me as cold and punitive, she could isolate me socially while keeping her own face clean. Isolation is one of the oldest tools in relationship warfare, and it works even on strong people, because humans are not built to stand alone forever. I decided that if a family dinner happened soon, I would not show up to argue, and I would not show up to beg. I would show up to watch, to listen, and to let her commit to her story in front of people who would remember it. If she wanted witnesses, I could live with that, because witnesses cut both ways. In the quiet hours before sleep, I reviewed my ledger again and asked myself what I still lacked. I had public tagging, a calendar contradiction, and a receipt time that anchored a lie in the real world. What I did not yet have was a clean link between her cover story and a formal trigger, something that would force consequences without requiring me to sound emotional. I needed the kind of mechanism that does not depend on my pain being believed. I needed policy, minutes, or a recorded process that would carry the weight for me. That meant I had to move toward a room where records are created, and where someone like Grant cannot simply wave away facts as marital drama. I turned off the light and lay in the dark, listening to the house settle again, and I realized that the next stage was not about discovering new betrayal. The betrayal was already obvious in my gut and increasingly visible on my page. The next stage was about choosing the right arena, the kind of arena where truth becomes official and denial becomes a liability. I did not know yet how quickly Grant would move to protect himself, but I knew he would move, because men like him never sit still when they sense risk. The only comfort I had was that I had been collecting dull truths, and dull truths are hard to kill. By the time Lila realized my calm was not forgiveness, she would already be standing on a floor I had quietly removed beneath her. The family dinner happened sooner than Ruth predicted, because gossip travels faster than common sense, and my wife had already lit the fuse in a room full of co-workers. Ruth invited us with the careful neutrality of a woman who has seen enough marriages fail to know that cheerfulness is often just denial wearing lipstick. Lila accepted immediately, which told me she wanted an audience more than she wanted peace, and she wanted the kind of audience that would remember her as charming even while she lied. I arrived with my face composed and my stomach tight, because family dinners are not meals. They are trials where everyone pretends they are only passing the salt. The table was set with the usual comforts, warm food, clean plates, polite smiles, and a soft light that made the room look gentler than the people inside it. Ruth greeted us like a judge who refuses to show her vote, and she watched Lila's hands and eyes more than her words. My brother sat across from me with that tense friendliness men use when they are praying they will not be asked to take a side. My aunt hovered near the kitchen doorway, pretending to be busy, because being busy is how people avoid responsibility for what they hear. Lila moved through the room like she belonged there more than I did, touching Ruth's shoulder, complimenting the food, laughing at small remarks, and acting as if the party incident had been nothing but a sharp joke that landed wrong. She wanted the room to accept her framing before the facts arrived, because whoever frames first usually wins. I stayed quiet at the start, because silence forces other people to fill it, and people reveal themselves when they fill silence. Lila talked about work stress, team conflicts, and how events can get emotional, and her phrasing sounded suspiciously polished again. She used soft disclaimers, careful qualifiers, and the kind of language that makes every wrongdoing sound like a misunderstanding. I watched Ruth's expression shift in small increments, because Ruth does not trust smoothness, and she trusts performance even less. My brother asked me how I felt about what happened, and he asked it like he wanted to be fair, but also like he wanted the answer to be short. I gave him a short, factual summary, and I did not add pain, because pain would invite debate, and I had no interest in debating reality. Lila then tried a different approach, the one designed to make me look unreasonable without saying it outright. She spoke about feeling unsupported, about the weight of expectations, about the need for humor to survive, and she implied that my reaction to her party remark had been harsh and disproportionate. She said it with a sympathetic tone, as if she was describing a sad misunderstanding, but the purpose was clear. She wanted my family to see my calm as cruelty, my boundary as punishment, and my refusal to accept insult as emotional fragility. It was clever in a cheap way, the kind of trick that works because most people would rather believe a charming person than a quiet one. Ruth listened without interrupting, because she was letting Lila dig her own hole, and Ruth has always understood that the best way to expose a lie is to let it decorate itself. When Lila finished, Ruth asked her a single question, simple enough to sound innocent and specific enough to demand an actual answer. Ruth asked about the day and time Lila claimed she was working late during the week, and she asked it like she was only curious about schedules. Lila answered quickly, then corrected herself, then returned to the first answer again, and she tried to cover the wobble by laughing lightly. That little stumble was the first crack visible to the room, because even people who love a smooth story can smell inconsistency when it is served on a plate. I waited until the room settled again, and then I asked my own question, equally simple and equally specific. I asked Lila to confirm one date and one time from her cover story, and I asked it with the calm tone of someone planning a grocery run. She gave me the same polished phrasing again, the same structure, and she added a detail that she thought sounded responsible, something about a compliance issue that needed attention. That detail would have sounded boring to most people, but to me it sounded like bait, because compliance language is not something she used casually before. It sounded like someone had coached her to name a concept that would make others back off and stop asking questions. I watched my brother's face as he processed it, because he knew Lila was not normally that precise about work, and his confusion grew in the space between her confidence and her credibility. I did not raise my voice, and I did not accuse her, because accusations would turn the room into a shouting match and give her the victim posture she was craving. Instead, I reached into my bag and pulled out a single sheet of paper, not a thick dossier, not a dramatic stack, just one clean page. I had exported our shared calendar week view as a PDF earlier that afternoon because I wanted something stable that could not be waved away as a misread screen. I had printed it at a local shop with a standard header and the date visible because print has a gravity that phone screens do not. I placed the page on the table as if I were placing a menu, and I let the room look at it before I said anything else. The calendar view showed the vague blocks Lila had used as cover, and it showed the overlapping commitments that made her story impossible. I did not highlight every line, because over-highlighting looks like desperation, and desperation is easy to dismiss. I had marked only one overlap with a pen, a clean circle around a time window that collided with her claim. I pointed to the circle without tapping, without theatrics, and I asked her to reconcile it with what she had just told everyone. For a moment, Lila's expression stayed composed because she had trained herself to hold her face in place. Then her eyes flicked to Ruth, then to my brother, then to my aunt, and in that flick I saw the same reflex she had shown at the party, the search for someone who would rescue her. She tried to explain the overlap away by saying schedules change, and meetings run long, and calendars are messy, and it was all just confusion. The problem with that explanation was that she had just presented her story as clear and responsible, and now she was asking the room to accept that it was chaotic and forgettable. Ruth did not argue with her, because Ruth does not argue with people who are cornered. She simply asks them to choose a lane. Ruth asked if Lila wanted the room to believe she was precise and truthful, or scattered and unreliable, because both could not be true at once. My brother shifted in his chair because he could feel the tension tighten around the table like wire. My aunt stopped pretending to be busy because printed paper has a way of grabbing attention even from cowards. Lila then made a move that told me more than any confession could have. She did not focus on the calendar, she focused on me, and she framed the calendar as evidence of my obsession, not evidence of her contradiction. She implied that I had been watching her, tracking her, building a case, and she tried to paint that as controlling behavior. It was a clean pivot, and it would have been effective if I had been shouting or snooping, but I had not been. The calendar was shared household infrastructure, and the printed view was a normal export anyone could produce. Her attempt to turn basic documentation into emotional abuse was the real reveal, because it showed she had been preparing a counter-narrative designed to poison the room against me. That was the moment the first major twist landed in my mind with ugly clarity. Lila was not only hiding an affair, she was building an official-sounding story where I was unstable, possessive, and dangerous in a quiet way. She was laying groundwork to protect herself professionally and socially by making me look like the risk, not her actions. The careful phrases, the compliance references, the repeated structures, all of it suddenly made sense as a coached script meant to withstand scrutiny. Someone had taught her how to frame my calm as threat and my documentation as harassment. Someone had given her language that could slide into HR processes without sounding like personal drama. Ruth saw it too, even if she did not name it, because Ruth has lived long enough to know when someone is trying to turn a husband into a villain for the convenience of the story. Ruth asked Lila why she needed such a defensive frame if she had done nothing wrong, and she asked it in a tone that carried disappointment rather than anger. Lila tried to soften, tried to reattach charm to the room, but charm does not stick well once paper is on the table. My brother asked if Lila had told people at work that I was unstable, and his voice sounded like he did not want the answer. Lila hesitated, then claimed she only asked for advice, only vented, only tried to protect herself from conflict, and the hedging made every word worse. I kept my posture relaxed because anger would have made her pivot credible, and calm made her pivot look calculated. I told the room, in plain language, that I had signed divorce papers before the party and handed them to her only after she chose to humiliate me publicly. I stated that I was not asking anyone to pick sides, and I was not asking for sympathy, and I was not asking for permission to leave a marriage that she called trash. I told them I was simply refusing to be rewritten into a monster because she did not want to own her choices. The room stayed quiet, because people are most silent when they realize their easy opinions were purchased with someone else's pain. Lila's face tightened again, and she tried to salvage control by turning to Ruth with a pleading softness, as if she had always been the victim in this family's story. Ruth did not reward the performance, and she did not punish it either, because Ruth understands that punishment creates martyrs. Ruth simply said that she expected honesty in her home, and that dishonesty would not be decorated as humor. That line landed harder than any yelling, because it came with finality, and it came from the person Lila had hoped would validate her. My aunt finally sat down, because she could no longer pretend this was just dinner, and the clink of her chair against the floor sounded like an admission. As we left, Lila walked beside me in silence, and the silence felt different now, sharper and more frightened. She had tried to isolate me socially, and instead, she had shown my family the machinery behind her charm. I did not feel victory, because victories in marriages are still losses, but I did feel the cold comfort of direction. Now I knew she was not only cheating, she was also building a protective narrative meant to ruin my credibility if I ever pushed back. That meant the next arena could not be private, and it could not be emotional, and it could not be based on who believed whom. It had to be institutional, recorded, and unavoidable, because the only way to beat a scripted lie is to force it into a room where scripts become minutes. When we reached the car, Lila finally spoke again, not with apology, but with a warning disguised as concern. She suggested that taking things public could damage my reputation, and she implied that people at work were already worried about my behavior. I nodded as if I appreciated her concern, because sarcasm is useful only when you keep it inside your own skull. Inside, though, my mind clicked into a new gear, because her warning told me what she feared most. She feared official records that she could not charm, and she feared being forced to choose between denial and documentation. I drove home with the printed calendar still in my bag, and I realized that Grant's shadow had likely reached further into my life than I wanted to admit. The only question now was how quickly they would move to stamp their version of me into the workplace before I could bring my boring truths into a room that keeps permanent notes. The following Monday arrived with the kind of quiet that only happens when people think a storm is coming and hope it hits someone else. I walked into the building and felt the social temperature drop, not because anyone hated me, but because uncertainty makes cowardice contagious. A few heads turned, then turned away too fast, as if eye contact could make them complicit. Lila's warning from the car still sat in my mind like a cheap perfume, sweet at first, then nauseating when you realize it is trying to cover something rotten. She had not apologized, and she had not admitted anything, and that told me she was no longer trying to fix the marriage. She was trying to control the record. I did not rush to confront her again, because I already had enough proof to start turning fog into a timeline. I also did not try to persuade anyone socially, because persuasion is pointless when the other side has an institution. Grant did not need friends to hurt me. He needed a meeting invite and a pretext. If he could label me disruptive or unstable inside HR channels, he could turn my calm into a threat on paper. And paper is what people fear more than truth. The best defense against that kind of attack is boring documentation delivered at the correct temperature, and I had been collecting boring facts like they were oxygen. Around mid-morning, the first real move came, and it came the way these things always come, through a calendar notification that pretends it is routine. My email chimed, and the subject line sat there with the bland confidence of authority. It was an invitation to a meeting with HR, a 30-minute slot, and the title used neutral words that meant nothing and everything at once. The sender was a scheduling alias attached to Grant's office, and the list of attendees included Grant, an administrative coordinator named Mara Voss, and me. There was no agenda, no details, and no explanation, because the absence of explanation is its own message. It tells you they believe they can summon you without having to justify why. I did not respond emotionally, because emotions are the raw material HR uses when it wants to shape a narrative about risk. I saved a screenshot of the email header with the subject line visible. Then I saved a second screenshot showing the calendar entry details with the date and time. I labeled them in my evidence folder using plain file names because dramatic labels turn into accusations later. I also printed the meeting invite because printers create artifacts that survive device failures, and I have learned not to trust a single format when someone powerful wants you erased. Before the meeting, I reviewed my ledger again, and I made one decision that felt small but changed everything. I would bring only 2 pages into that room, and I would bring them in a way that made them hard to dismiss. One page would be the relevant policy line, not the whole policy manual, not a thick stack, just the specific clause that mattered. The second page would be one proof page that supported a single factual claim because claims are easy to debate and facts are not. I chose the calendar overlap export because it was shared infrastructure and therefore not invasive, and I paired it with the receipt confirmation photo printed cleanly with the time visible. Those 2 items together were not romance or jealousy. They were inconsistency anchored to a timestamp, and timestamps are what institutions respect when they are forced to. I arrived at the meeting room 5 minutes early, because being late is how you signal nervousness. The room was small and sterile, with frosted glass walls, a table that looked designed to discourage warmth, and a box of tissues placed in the corner like an insult. Grant was already there, sitting in a chair that angled him toward the door as if he owned it. Mara sat near a laptop, fingers poised like she was ready to type history into existence. Grant stood when I entered, not as a courtesy, but as a way to control the opening energy, and he smiled the same controlled smile he had used in the restaurant. He looked like a man ready to keep everything smooth, which is how you know he was ready to turn sharp if needed. He began the meeting the way HR begins all meetings, by implying that the purpose is safety and harmony. He framed it as concern about workplace atmosphere, about personal matters bleeding into professional life, and about ensuring everyone felt comfortable. The words were soft, but the intent was hard, because the real purpose was to establish a record where I was the unpredictable element. He spoke in broad terms, and he watched my face with careful attention, waiting for me to react too strongly or defend myself too aggressively. If I gave him either, he would have what he wanted, which was a sentence in a file describing my tone as escalated. I kept my posture relaxed and my breathing even, because calm is the only weapon you can carry into an HR room without being accused of threatening someone. When he finished his opening framing, I asked, in a neutral tone, what specific behavior of mine had triggered the meeting. I did not accuse him of bias, and I did not mention my wife, and I did not demand justice. I asked a simple clarifying question, because clarifying questions force specificity, and specificity is where liars get nervous. Grant did not answer directly. He spoke about perceptions, concerns, and patterns, and he used words that were designed to sound responsible while staying unprovable. That was when I placed my 2 pages on the table, not shoved forward, not slammed down, just set down neatly, as if I were handing over forms at a counter. I told them I was not there to discuss feelings or to create drama, and I said I wanted the record to reflect only verifiable facts. I indicated the policy line first, because policy is the language Grant worships. Then I indicated the proof page, because proof is the language he fears when it cannot be massaged. I did not over-explain, because over-explanation sounds like desperation. I asked them to look at the dates, the times, and the overlap, and I asked them to note the inconsistency between the stated cover story and the documented schedule. Grant's expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough that I could see his internal calculations start moving faster. He tried to pivot immediately, suggesting that personal disputes should be handled privately and that the workplace was not the venue for marital conflict. The problem with his pivot was that he had brought me into a workplace meeting, which made the workplace the venue, and now he was asking me to pretend it was not. I stayed calm and responded that I agreed personal matters should be private, and that was why I had not made any public scene at work. I then pointed out that the meeting itself created a record, and if a record was being created, it should be accurate and complete, not shaped by rumors. Mara looked at the pages and then at Grant, because coordinators like her understand that what they type becomes a kind of reality. I could see her hesitate, because she was used to typing the version of reality that made leadership comfortable. I addressed Mara directly with polite formality and asked her to note that I had provided documentation for review. I did not ask her to take sides, and I did not ask her to judge my marriage. I asked her to record that evidence was received, because the phrase evidence received is a small sentence with big consequences later. Mara nodded once, and that nod mattered more than any argument, because nods turn into minutes. Grant attempted a second angle, suggesting that my gathering of documents could be interpreted as harassment or intimidation. He spoke as if he was protecting someone from me, which was the same shape of narrative Lila had tried to build at the family dinner. He wanted my documentation to look like obsession, because obsession is what lets them label you dangerous without proving anything. I responded by keeping my voice steady and pointing out that the calendar view was shared household infrastructure and that the receipt confirmation was from my own account activity. I stated that I had not accessed private devices, and I had not followed anyone, and I had not contacted co-workers to spread rumors. I said I was simply providing factual material relevant to the concerns that had triggered this meeting. Grant did not like that, because it gave him nothing dramatic to hook. He then tried to turn the conversation toward my demeanor at the party, describing the divorce papers moment as aggressive. He wanted the divorce papers to become the centerpiece, because divorce papers are emotional and easy to spin. I did not take the bait. I said the divorce papers were a personal matter that occurred outside the workplace, and that I would not discuss private legal decisions in an HR meeting. I then returned the focus to the documented inconsistency and asked again what specific workplace risk I had created. Grant's mouth tightened slightly, because he was trapped between wanting to control the story and needing to sound legitimate while doing it. Mara finally spoke with careful neutrality and asked if the documentation should be forwarded for review under the appropriate policy. Grant hesitated, because sending it forward meant losing some control. He tried to delay, suggesting they should first discuss privately with Lila to understand context. That suggestion sounded reasonable on the surface, but the subtext was obvious. It meant he wanted to give her time to adjust her story and align her script with the dates. I did not argue against it openly, because arguing would have sounded emotional. Instead, I asked Mara to note in the minutes that I requested the documentation be preserved without alteration and reviewed under standard process. I said it as if it were a routine request, because routine language makes it harder for them to claim I was threatening. Mara typed, and the sound of the keys was suddenly the loudest thing in the room. Grant's eyes flicked to the laptop screen, and I could see the moment he realized that he had lost control of the opening narrative. He could not label me unstable when I was sitting there calmly requesting accurate record-keeping. He could not dismiss my evidence as harassment when the sources were shared calendar infrastructure and my own transaction activity. He could not claim I was using illegal surveillance when I had done nothing of the kind. The only move he had left was to close the meeting quickly before the room became a courtroom. He ended it with the promise of review and the usual HR language about maintaining professionalism. He reminded me to avoid escalating conflict in the workplace, which was rich coming from the man who had summoned me. I nodded and thanked him for his time, because politeness is a blade when you know how to hold it. I stood, gathered my pages, and then made one final request that was small enough to sound harmless and sharp enough to matter. I asked for the case reference number for the meeting record, because reference numbers turn conversations into files, and files do not disappear as easily. Mara gave it to me, and I saved it in my notes as soon as I left the room, because memory is unreliable, and institutions count on that. In the hallway, I felt the first true shift of power since the party, and it did not come from shouting or threats. It came from a case ID and the knowledge that something had been typed into a system Grant could not fully control. That was the second major twist forming at the edge of my awareness, the sense that the real proof might not be the receipts or the calendar at all. The real proof might be the fact that the institution itself had now been forced to acknowledge the existence of evidence, and once that acknowledgement sits inside minutes, it becomes a trap. Lila could deny in private all she wanted, but denial looks different when a record exists that says evidence was received and review was opened. When I got home that night, Lila tried to read my face the way she always did, and I gave her nothing readable. She asked if my day was okay, and her voice carried that careful softness again, the kind that tries to coax information without sounding like interrogation. I told her the day was normal, and then I went to the kitchen to make tea, because normalcy is the most terrifying mask you can wear when someone is expecting chaos. Behind my calm, the ledger was growing heavier, and the clock was ticking toward a public arena where witnesses and records would collide. The only thing I could not yet predict was how desperate Grant would become now that he knew I was not going to react like the kind of man he could manage. The week after the HR meeting felt like living inside a building where the lights never fully turn off, because someone is always watching for movement. I could tell the record had changed the air because people who used to look past me now looked at me and then looked away, like my calm had become suspicious. Grant did not speak to me directly in the hallways anymore, but his influence traveled without him, carried in small shifts that only happen when leadership has made a quiet request. Meetings I used to be invited to were suddenly full. My name was missing from a few routine threads, and an office administrator who once greeted me warmly now greeted me with a thin professional smile. None of it was dramatic enough to complain about, which was the point, because subtle pressure is harder to prove and easier to deny. Lila played her part at home with the precision of a woman who believed she could outlast reality. She leaned into domestic normalcy in small ways that were meant to confuse me: cooking, tidying, mentioning errands, asking about work with a tone that suggested concern rather than surveillance. Underneath the softness, though, she kept testing for information, and her questions had edges, like she wanted to know what HR had said and what had been typed. She never asked directly, because directness would have sounded guilty, so she used casual phrasing that could be explained as curiosity. I answered in neutral summaries and never offered specifics, because specifics are fuel, and I was not going to hand her gasoline to pour on her own narrative fire. The smear began to surface in the way these things always surface, through someone else's mouth. Nolan pulled me aside near the coffee station and told me, with the careful restraint of a man protecting himself, that some people had heard I was spiraling. The rumor said I was documenting my wife's movements, contacting staff, and creating a hostile environment, which was rich considering I had done nothing but show up to meetings and speak in plain facts. Nolan did not accuse me, and he did not comfort me, because finance people do not do either when risk is nearby. He simply warned me that HR language was appearing in the gossip, which meant the rumor had passed through someone trained to make it sound official. That confirmed what my instincts had been whispering since the party, which was that Lila's cover story was not just a lie, it was an engineered defense designed to make me look like the threat. At home that evening, I decided to stop guessing and start pinning down contradictions in a way that required no private access and no dramatic confrontation. Lila had already told multiple versions of her schedule in front of Ruth, and she had told at least one version to HR, and she had likely told another version to her friends at work. People forget that consistency is the real enemy of deception, because consistency forces them to live inside their lies instead of floating above them. I waited until she was relaxed, then asked her to clarify a small detail about one of the nights she had been late, phrased like I was planning dinner and needed to know whether to cook. She answered quickly, then added an unnecessary detail about a meeting that ran long, then mentioned a compliance matter again, as if she could sprinkle the word compliance and make everyone back away. I nodded, and I asked the same question again in a slightly different way, not because I needed the answer, but because I wanted to hear whether her wording stayed identical. Her response came out with the same structure as before, the same phrases, the same smooth disclaimers, like she was reading from a card in her head. That repetition might have sounded reassuring to someone who wanted to believe her, but to me it sounded like coaching. I asked a third time, still calm, still ordinary, and this time she changed one element, not the date, but the reason, and the shift happened so quickly it was almost invisible. That was the crack I needed, because it showed she was choosing from a menu rather than telling a memory. I did not accuse her, because accusation would turn her into an actress in distress, and she would perform that role better than any truth I could offer. Instead, I said I wanted clarity for the separation process, and I told her I needed her cover story written down so we could avoid miscommunication later. I framed it as practical, like a man trying to reduce conflict, because practicality is harder to attack than suspicion. Lila hesitated, then agreed with a smile that tried to look patient, and she picked up a pen and wrote a short summary of her explanation on a piece of paper. She wrote it quickly, with confidence, and when she finished, she slid the paper toward me like she had just proven something. I did not read it out loud, and I did not comment on it in the moment. I picked up my phone and took a photograph of the page with the writing visible, making sure the date on my phone screen was visible in the frame as well. I did it openly and without apology, because secrecy would make it look like spying, and openness made it look like documentation. Lila's expression tightened at the corners, and she asked why I was doing that, using a tone that suggested I was crossing a line. I told her I was keeping a clean record for the separation, because we both deserved accuracy. I said it calmly, and the calm bothered her more than anger would have, because calm gave her no emotional hook to hang a victim story on. After she went upstairs, I sat at the table and compared her written cover story to the two verbal versions I already had recorded in my notes. I did not need to be a genius to see the differences, because she had changed the order of events and swapped one excuse for another. I placed the written page beside my printed calendar overlap and my receipt confirmation printout, and the pattern was now clear enough that even a stranger would see it. The lies were not random. They were shaped around policy language and workplace optics, and that meant the affair and the cover-up were being protected by someone who understood institutional pressure. I added the new photo to my evidence folder, labeled it plainly, and wrote a short line in my ledger describing the written cover story and its contradictions with prior statements. The next day at work, the pressure increased in small ways that were designed to make me lose patience. A meeting I needed access to was rescheduled without notice, and then I received a new invite that included Grant's assistant and a vague subject line about alignment. The timing felt intentional, like someone was trying to keep me in a constant state of mild disruption. My manager asked if everything was okay at home, and he asked it with a tone that suggested he already knew the rumor version. I responded with professional neutrality and said I was handling private matters privately, which was true, and I watched his shoulders relax when he realized I was not going to turn his office into a confession booth. He did not want the truth. He wanted the risk to be low, and I was making it low by staying boring. By that afternoon, Nolan sent me a short message that told me more than a full conversation would have. He said the HR case reference number had been mentioned in a context that sounded like someone was trying to shape it, as if the case existed to document me rather than the concerns I had raised. That meant Grant was already trying to control the record's meaning, which was what I expected, but the speed of it confirmed desperation. A desperate administrator becomes sloppy because control requires patience, and patience is hard when your own name might get dragged into the light. I realized then that my next move could not be another private clarification, because private clarifications can be edited, softened, or delayed. I needed a public arena where records were created in real time, where witnesses were present, and where someone like Grant could not quietly spin the narrative afterward. The corporate all-hands town hall was scheduled for the end of the month, a quarterly ritual where leadership pretends transparency while carefully controlling what questions are allowed. It was the kind of event Lila loved because it was a stage with microphones and applause, and it was the kind of event Grant relied on because he could manage the room through policy and procedure. It also happened to be the perfect arena for my method, because a room full of employees becomes a witness field, and witnesses make denial expensive. I did not plan a speech, because speeches invite debate, and debate invites distraction. I planned a sequence of verified facts that could be handed to the right hands, the kind of facts that become minutes when typed. That night, I refined my evidence into something that looked as neutral as possible. I created one single-page timeline that listed dates, places, and payments without commentary, because commentary is where emotions hide. I attached only the most stable support, the tagged story screenshot with date stamp, the printed calendar overlap, the receipt confirmation with time, and the photo of Lila's written cover story. I kept the layout plain and professional, not because I wanted to impress anyone, but because I wanted to remove every excuse for dismissal. If someone tried to call it harassment, I wanted the page to look like a record, not a weapon. If someone tried to call it jealousy, I wanted the page to look like scheduling and accounting, not heartbreak. Lila sensed my shift, because manipulators are experts at detecting when you stop playing the old game. She became sweeter, then sharper, then sweet again, cycling through tones like she was searching for the combination that used to work. She implied that people at work were worried about me, and that I might damage my future by escalating, which was the same warning she had delivered after Ruth's dinner. She tried to pull me into a private conversation where she could trade tears for concessions, because tears in private never make it into records. I refused without refusing, answering with brief, practical statements and then returning to ordinary tasks, because the best way to defeat emotional bait is to act like it is not bait at all. The more I stayed calm, the more she revealed fear in small ways she could not fully mask. She started checking her phone more often, then hiding it more carefully, then leaving it in rooms she never left it in before, as if she was trying to control what I might accidentally see. She hinted that Grant had concerns about workplace disruption, which told me she had been speaking to him and that he had been speaking to her. That confirmation settled in my chest like a final weight, because it meant the affair and the cover-up were not separate problems. They were part of one system, a system built to protect her image and his control. I went to bed that night with my timeline page in a sleeve and my evidence folder backed up in 2 places, not because I feared losing my phone, but because I feared the way institutions erase inconvenient things. I understood that the town hall would not be about marriage, and it would not be about revenge, and it would not be about my feelings. It would be about records, minutes, and who controlled the story when facts entered the room. Lila believed she could humiliate me and then replace me socially without paying a price, and Grant believed he could manage my reaction the way he managed everything else, through labels and process. They had both mistaken my silence for confusion and my calm for weakness, and they were about to learn that calm is sometimes just a man choosing the cleanest way to end a lie. By the time I closed my eyes, the plan was no longer a concept, it was a schedule. I would not scream, I would not beg, and I would not accuse anyone of anything they could deny in a clean sentence. I would bring verified documents into a public arena, and I would let the room do what rooms always do when confronted with proof. The worst part for Lila would not be the divorce, because she had already joked about wanting a new marriage. The worst part would be the moment she realized her scripted story could not survive a timeline that never raised its voice. The last week before the town hall stretched out like a long corridor with doors on both sides, and every door felt like it might open into a new complication. I kept moving through my days with deliberate normalcy, because nothing scares manipulators more than a man who refuses to flinch. The rumors did not vanish. They simply changed shape, drifting from public chatter into quieter channels where people think they are safe, and I could feel the office deciding what kind of story it wanted to believe. Some people wanted to believe Lila's version because it was easier, because it made the party moment a joke instead of a warning. Other people wanted to believe mine because they had always suspected something was rotten, and proof gave them permission to admit it without looking cruel. I did not feed either group, because feeding crowds makes you dependent on their appetite, and I needed independence more than I needed approval. I spent one evening walking the neighborhood with my phone in my pocket, and my mind working like a machine, because walking helps me separate emotions from structure. The air was cold and clean, and the streetlights painted everything in pale pools that made the world look simpler than it is. I passed the corner cafe where people sit and pretend they are not listening to each other's conversations, and I noticed how often my name seemed to drift into their glances. Lila had been social here, friendly with neighbors, careful to appear like a stable, charming woman, and stability is a disguise that can survive a lot of rumors. I knew that if a neutral witness existed, she would likely be someone Lila had underestimated, because Lila always underestimated people who were not useful to her. That was how I ended up thinking again about Tess Lorne, my neighbor, the woman who had once mentioned Lila's late nights in that casual tone people use when they do not realize they are dropping a seed. I did not go to Tess's door like a desperate man, because desperation repels truth and invites pity, and pity is unreliable. Instead, I waited for a natural moment, because natural moments create statements that do not look forced. The next day, I saw Tess near the mailboxes in our building lobby, juggling packages and looking mildly irritated in the way people look when they are tired of everyone's small selfishness. I helped her with one of the heavier boxes, and we exchanged the kind of polite words neighbors exchange to prove they are still civilized. I did not mention Lila immediately, because naming the topic too soon would have made her defensive. I let the conversation drift toward routine, toward schedules, toward the building's strange habit of becoming noisier at night. Tess mentioned, without being prompted, that the doorman had changed shifts recently, and that the building felt less orderly, and that she had seen more late arrivals in general. It was ordinary gossip, the kind that sounds harmless, but it was an opening, and I stepped through it without pushing. I asked calmly if she had noticed anything unusual around our unit in the past month, phrased like I cared about building security rather than my marriage. Tess hesitated, because people like her are not eager to step into marital wars, and then she admitted that she had seen Lila return late more than once, usually with her phone in hand and her head down, like she was trying to disappear into the elevator. Tess also admitted that one night she had seen Lila walk in close beside a man, and the two of them had moved like they believed nobody mattered but them. I did not ask Tess to identify the man, because that kind of request turns a witness into a target, and targets get scared. I asked only for the date and approximate time, and I asked it like I was confirming a delivery schedule. Tess gave me a window, not exact to the minute, but close enough to matter, and she described one detail that made my mind tighten with recognition. She said the man had a sleek coat and a thin leather messenger bag, the kind that hangs at a precise angle, the kind you see on men who live inside conference rooms. That bag detail felt connected to the world Grant controlled, and it made my skin go colder because it suggested the affair's footprint might be closer to the workplace than Lila wanted anyone to believe. I thanked Tess, and I did not pressure her further because pressure makes people back away. I asked if she would be willing to write down a single-sentence summary of what she recalled, and I framed it as something I needed for separation logistics, because separation logistics sound boring and safe. Tess looked at me with the careful skepticism of someone who does not want to be manipulated. Then she nodded slowly, because she could sense I was not hunting for drama. She agreed to write one sentence, nothing more, and she told me she did not want her name shared widely. I told her I would keep it minimal and lawful, and that I would not throw her into a public fire. We met the next morning in the cafe down the street, the same one where the espresso machine always sounded slightly too loud. Tess wrote a single sentence on a small sheet of paper, stating that she saw Lila arrive late on a specific night and that she observed her walking beside an unidentified man toward our elevator. The sentence was plain and unembellished, which made it stronger. I took a photograph of the note with my phone, making sure the timestamp was visible, and I also wrote the date and time on the corner of the paper with my own pen, then asked Tess to initial it. She did, reluctantly, and that small initial mattered because it made the note feel less like rumor and more like a recorded observation. I thanked her again, and I ended the conversation quickly, because lingering makes people nervous, and nervous people reconsider. On the way back home, I replayed the observation against my existing timeline, and it fit with an ugly neatness. The night Tess noted overlapped with one of Lila's vague calendar blocks, and it was close to the date of the restaurant receipt, close enough to suggest a routine rather than a one-time mistake. I did not feel a surge of rage because rage had already burned out into something colder. What I felt was the steady tightening of a net, one knot at a time, each knot made of small, lawful facts. I added Tess's note into my evidence folder, labeled it neutrally, and updated my one-page timeline with a short line referencing a neighbor sighting. No drama, no adjectives. That afternoon, the office shifted again, not through an announcement, but through behavior. Lila's friends stopped making eye contact with me, and a few people who once joked easily now spoke in clipped professional phrases. I could tell someone had instructed them to keep distance, as if proximity to me might become evidence of complicity. Grant passed me once near the elevator bank, and he did not stop, but his eyes slid over me like a measuring device. He wanted to know whether I looked like a man who would explode, because an explosion would solve his problem. I refused to look explosive, and I refused to look pleading, and I gave him the most dangerous thing you can give a man who thrives on controlling narratives, which is a face he cannot read. The town hall was 2 days away, and I spent that evening refining my materials into something that could be handled by an administrator without confusion. I printed the one-page timeline again on clean paper because smudges create opportunities for dismissal. I attached my supporting proof in a simple sequence, each item labeled by date and source in plain language. I did not include personal conclusions, because conclusions invite debate. I included only the kind of information that forces other people to ask uncomfortable questions on their own. I placed each set into a clear sleeve, and I prepared enough copies that the room's gatekeepers could not claim there was only one copy, and it got lost. The act felt clinical, like preparing documents for a routine filing, and I preferred it that way, because clinical actions are harder to demonize. Late that night, I received an email from Mara Voss, the coordinator who typed for HR, and the subject line was bland enough to be threatening. It was a brief note stating that the HR case review was ongoing and reminding all parties to maintain professionalism. It did not mention my documentation directly, but the phrasing was careful, as if someone had drafted it to create a paper trail of warnings. I saved the email header into my folder and printed it once, because I wanted to track how they were attempting to frame the timeline. Then I noticed something else, something small that would have looked meaningless to a casual reader, but to me, it felt like a loose stitch. The email contained a reference to a review meeting date that did not match the invite I had originally received, and the mismatch was subtle, like someone had copied a template and forgotten to update a line. That mismatch suggested that multiple records existed, and that someone was already trying to shift the story by shifting timestamps. The realization did not hit like a dramatic twist, it hit like a cold hand on the back of my neck. If they were already adjusting internal references, it meant the record was not stable unless it was anchored to something visible. I had assumed the receipts and calendar were the key, but now I began to suspect the real battlefield was the minutes themselves, the typed entries that decide what becomes official. If Mara typed evidence received, that phrase could become a trap that even Grant could not step around later. If she did not type it, and instead typed something like concerned about disruptive behavior, the case could be turned against me. The fight was not only about what happened, it was about how the institution described what happened. The next morning, Lila tried to lure me into a private confrontation with a new tactic, using vulnerability like a tool rather than a feeling. She told me she felt unsafe in the marriage, not physically unsafe, but emotionally unsafe, and she framed my documentation as a kind of intimidation. She did it with a careful softness, like she was practicing lines meant to sound credible in an office. She wanted me to react defensively, because defensive reactions can be described as aggressive reactions by people who control the record. I listened without interrupting, then told her calmly that she was free to speak to a mediator or attorney about her feelings, and that I would not argue about feelings inside our kitchen. I said that clarity would come from dates and documents, and I returned to making coffee as if the conversation had been about weather. Her face hardened for a moment before she repaired it, and that flicker of anger was more honest than anything she had said in days. She asked if I planned to embarrass her at the town hall, and she asked it as if she was concerned about workplace harmony. I told her I planned to do nothing emotional and nothing theatrical, and I told her I would only ensure that any record created about me was accurate. That answer frightened her, because accuracy is the enemy of scripted narratives. She left the kitchen without another word, and the sound of her footsteps on the stairs felt less like retreat and more like a scramble. That afternoon, Nolan stopped by my desk and told me, quietly, that Grant had been asking questions about whether I planned to raise private matters during the town hall Q&A. Grant was trying to preempt me by framing me as a disruptor before I ever did anything. Nolan warned me that leadership could shut down microphones, cut questions, and end the session early if they felt threatened. I thanked him and told him I understood, because I did. I did not need a microphone, and I did not need to ask questions publicly. My weapon was not speech, it was placement, and placement is something you can accomplish without ever stepping on a stage. That night, I prepared the final piece, not a new proof, but a delivery plan that relied on procedure rather than theatrics. I labeled my evidence sleeves clearly, placed them in a simple binder, and attached a cover sheet that stated, in neutral language, that the enclosed materials were provided for review and record keeping regarding the existing HR case. I did not accuse anyone of cheating on the cover sheet, because accusations can be dismissed as personal drama. I described only inconsistencies in documented timelines relevant to concerns that had triggered HR involvement. I kept the language boring enough to pass through administrative hands without triggering an immediate defensive shutdown. The goal was not to win an argument. The goal was to force the institution to touch the truth. When I finally lay down, the house felt like a waiting room, quiet but tense, and I could sense Lila awake in the other room, her mind working the way mine was working, but in the opposite direction. She was trying to find a way to survive without admitting anything, and I was trying to end it without becoming the villain in her script. The town hall was less than a day away now, and the pressure in my chest was not fear, it was focus. Somewhere inside the system, a record already existed with my name on it, and the next record would decide whether I was labeled as a problem or as a man who refused to be rewritten. I closed my eyes and held on to the same simple rule I had followed since the party, which was that I would not raise my voice, and I would not beg for belief. I would let small truths pile up until the room could no longer pretend it was only watching a joke. Town hall day arrived like a deadline you can smell in the air, because the building had that restless quiet that comes before a controlled spectacle. People dressed a little sharper, spoke a little softer, and moved through the lobby like they were entering a church where the sermon could cost them their jobs. I walked in with a plain binder in my bag and a neutral expression on my face, because nothing in my posture could look like protest. My goal was not to hijack a microphone, and it was not to perform rage in front of an audience, and it was not to accuse anyone in a way that could be dismissed as marital drama. My goal was to force contact between verified documents and an official record, so the institution itself had to acknowledge what was true. The auditorium space was set up like every corporate ritual: bright stage lights, polished screens, and rows of chairs that make adults feel like obedient students. The production crew tested audio, staff placed water bottles, and a few executives hovered near the front with the controlled smiles of people who think attention equals love. I saw Mara Voss at a side table with a laptop and a stack of agenda sheets, already in her role as the woman who would decide what the official story sounded like. I also saw Grant Morrow near the stage stairs, speaking to two department heads with the calm authority of a man who believes he can bend any room by choosing the right words. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes kept drifting across the crowd, searching for threats, because he did not fear chaos. He feared evidence. Lila arrived a few minutes later, wearing the kind of composure that is meant to look like innocence. She moved through the room with practiced ease, greeting people, smiling, touching shoulders lightly, and behaving like the town hall was her natural habitat. The party insult had been her opening move, and she still believed she could convert that moment into a story where she was bold and funny, and I was brittle and cruel. When her eyes landed on me, she did not look surprised, and she did not look apologetic. She looked cautious, like someone watching an animal they are not sure is fully domesticated. She found a place a few rows from the front, close enough to be seen and far enough to avoid being caught in my orbit. I did not approach her, because approaching her would have turned everything personal, and personal was the only lane where she still had power. Instead, I moved toward Mara's table at the side, keeping my pace steady and my hands visible. I waited for a natural opening, because barging into an administrative station looks like disruption even when you are polite. When she glanced up, I gave her a simple greeting, then told her I was submitting materials relevant to the existing HR case, and that I wanted the submission documented as received on today's date. I kept my tone flat and procedural, because procedural language disarms emotional framing. I slid the binder forward and pointed out the cover sheet that referenced the case number, the date, and the request for standard review and record keeping. Mara's eyes flicked to the case number, then to my face, then back to the binder, and I could see the internal calculation begin. She was deciding whether accepting the binder would make her a witness, and she was deciding whether rejecting it would create a new problem she might later have to explain. She asked, in careful administrative phrasing, whether the materials were appropriate to submit during an all-hands event. I answered, still calm, that I was not requesting stage time or public discussion, and that I was simply ensuring the record reflected an evidence submission on a date when all parties were on site. I told her I was not asking her to judge anything, only to log receipt and route it according to process. I could see her shoulders loosen slightly, because process is the only religion administrators are allowed to practice openly. She placed the binder beside her laptop and opened a simple intake sheet, the kind that turns objects into tracked items. She wrote the case number and the time, then asked me to confirm my name for accuracy. I confirmed it, watched her type it, and then watched her add a short note that the materials were received for review. That sentence was small, but it had weight, because weight is what records create. I thanked her, stepped away, and kept moving, because lingering would have made me look like I wanted attention. I did not want attention. I wanted a timestamp. As I returned to my seat, I noticed Grant's gaze follow me from across the room. He did not stare openly, because he was too polished for that, but his attention moved in quick, controlled glances, the way a man watches a door he hopes stays closed. Lila leaned toward him briefly near the aisle, and they exchanged a few words I could not hear, but their body language spoke clearly. She had the tight smile of someone trying to appear relaxed, and he had the calm nod of someone offering reassurance. The gap between them was smaller than professional comfort usually allows, and the familiarity looked practiced rather than spontaneous. In my mind, Tess's description of the man with the messenger bag returned like a bitter echo, and I felt the pieces try to lock together. Grant carried a slim, leather messenger bag on his shoulder that day, hanging at the precise angle Tess had described, and he moved with the same confident economy I had seen in the restaurant. The bag itself proved nothing, because bags are not confessions, but patterns are rarely made of one item. Patterns are made of repetition, proximity, and timing, and I already had timing. I had restaurant receipts anchored to my account, shared calendar overlaps, a public story tag that vanished when danger appeared, and now a neighbor's observation of a late-night arrival with an unidentified man who looked like he belonged to the corporate world. The second major twist did not land as a dramatic reveal, because real twists do not arrive with music. It landed as a cold, logical suspicion that the lover was not a random thrill. The lover was connected to the institution that was already trying to label me. The town hall began with the usual performance, executives talking about growth, culture, and resilience, words meant to sound like values while functioning as a curtain. The screen behind them cycled through clean graphics, and the room responded with polite applause that sounded more like obligation than enthusiasm. I listened without reacting because none of that mattered. What mattered was how often Grant glanced toward Mara's station, and how often Mara's fingers moved across the laptop as if she was logging something. Every time Grant looked at that table, his eyes tightened slightly, and it told me he was tracking whether my binder was becoming a record he could not contain. When the Q&A segment started, questions were filtered through a digital system and selected by the moderator, which meant the illusion of openness stayed intact while real control remained. I did not submit a question because I did not need to. A question would have been a speech disguised as curiosity, and speeches invite counter-speeches. Documents do not argue back, and that is why administrators fear them. Still, I watched as a few questions about culture and fairness were answered with polished non-answers, and I watched how the room leaned forward when something hinted at real conflict. People are hungry for truth, but they pretend they are hungry for reassurance, and institutions survive by feeding them reassurance instead. Halfway through, I noticed a subtle shift near the stage, as if a private signal had been given. Grant stepped off to the side and spoke briefly to a security supervisor, the kind of man whose job is to remove friction while pretending it was always necessary. The supervisor's eyes flicked toward my row, then away, then back, and the movement was small but unmistakable. Grant was trying to set conditions where I could be framed as a threat before I had done anything. He did not need me to speak. He needed the room to believe I might. The smear narrative was already built, and now he was preparing to use it as a justification for containment. I did not move, because movement would have looked like intent, and intent is what they needed to assign me. I stayed seated, hands relaxed, posture neutral, eyes on the stage like every other employee. The security supervisor hovered closer, not directly beside me, but within the perimeter of my awareness, the way predators test boundaries without committing. Lila kept her face forward, but her shoulders were tense, and she kept adjusting the position of her phone in her lap, as if she was ready to capture something. That detail mattered, because it suggested she wanted footage of me reacting, not footage of her lying. She wanted a clip that could become a weapon later, and she wanted it more than she wanted the town hall itself. During a pause between segments, Mara stood and moved to a side room with her laptop, carrying the binder with her. The motion was deliberate, and it looked like she was going to log the materials more formally or route them to a secure intake area. Grant noticed immediately, and his jaw tightened for a fraction of a second before he smoothed it back into neutrality. He followed at a distance that looked casual but was not. Lila remained in her seat, but her eyes tracked the same direction, and the three of them were suddenly connected by invisible tension lines, like a diagram you only see once you know what you are looking for. I stayed where I was and let them move, because chasing would have made me look aggressive, and I refused to become the character they needed. Instead, I watched the crowd, because crowds are where pressure shows up in new ways. People around me whispered softly, not about the speech, but about the way security was positioned, about the way HR staff had clustered near the side door, about the strange mood that felt heavier than a normal corporate event. They sensed conflict, even if they did not understand it, because humans are built to detect social danger. The room was becoming a witness field, and witnesses change the cost of lies. A few minutes later, Mara returned to her station looking paler, and she kept her eyes on her screen as if she was trying not to look at anyone. Grant returned too, still composed, but the smoothness on his face looked more strained now, like the effort was taking more energy. I could not see the binder on the table anymore, and that absence told me it had been filed somewhere official, somewhere with a path and a trail. Lila finally turned slightly in her seat, glancing back toward me for the first time in a while, and the look on her face was not anger. It was calculation mixed with fear, the expression of someone realizing the story might be slipping out of her hands. By the end of the town hall, the applause sounded thinner, because the room had absorbed attention it could not name. People stood, gathered their things, and moved toward the exits with the restless energy of a crowd that knows something happened behind the curtain. Grant stayed near the stage, speaking to executives and security with measured calm, but his eyes kept scanning for me, and I could feel the shape of his next move forming. He would try to isolate me, provoke me, or label me, because that was the only path left to regain control. Lila moved toward the side exit instead of the main aisle, following the HR cluster, and her choice of exit was a confession of allegiance more than any words could have been. I left through the main doors with my hands empty and my face unreadable, because my evidence was no longer in my possession. It was in the system, and systems do not care about charm once they are forced to hold paper. In the lobby, my phone buzzed with a new calendar notification, and when I glanced down, I saw a meeting request for the next morning, tagged urgent, with Grant and a senior compliance officer included. The subject line was bland, but the roster was not. They were escalating, not because they were confident, but because they were frightened. I walked into the cold evening air and felt the city's noise wrap around me like something honest. The town hall had ended without fireworks, exactly as I wanted, because fireworks are how liars claim you were unstable. Now the real confrontation was scheduled behind closed doors, where Grant would try to regain control, and where I would force one last piece of the truth into a record he could not edit. I got into my car and sat for a moment without starting the engine, listening to the quiet tick of the cooling metal. The next meeting was not going to be about my marriage on the surface, and it was not going to be about my feelings. It was going to be about the binder that had entered the system, and about how far Grant would go to keep his name from being stapled to my timeline. The urgent meeting invite sat in my calendar like a loaded chamber, because it carried names that only appear when someone wants the record to hurt you. It was Grant, a senior compliance officer named Elaine Hart, and Mara as note-taker, which meant the room would produce minutes designed to survive scrutiny. I arrived early again, because punctuality is the simplest form of control, and I walked in with empty hands because my binder was already inside their system. Grant was there first, seated with his messenger bag beside him like a prop he forgot to put away. Elaine sat across the table with a thin folder and a blank expression, the kind of face that says she has seen every excuse and hates all of them equally. Mara opened her laptop, fingers hovering, ready to turn tone into evidence. Grant began with the same smooth framing, claiming the concern was disruption, workplace safety, and the need to prevent private conflicts from contaminating the company. He tried to make it sound like he was protecting the organization from my instability, not protecting himself from my documents. Elaine did not nod at his speech the way HR people usually do, because she was not there to soothe him. She asked, in plain language, why the existing case had escalated to compliance and why a town hall submission had been routed into her queue overnight. Grant attempted to answer without being specific, but Elaine forced specificity by repeating the question with fewer words. Mara typed while he spoke, and the sound of keys made the room feel less like a discussion and more like a deposition. Elaine then opened her folder and slid one page onto the table, face up, as if she were placing a clean blade between us. It was my cover sheet, the one that referenced the case number and requested standard record keeping. Beneath it was the one-page timeline, dates, places, payments, and the attached proof list, all presented without accusation and without emotion. Elaine stated that the documents were now part of the record and that the organization would assess them as such. Grant's smile stayed in place, but it looked glued, and his eyes moved quickly toward Mara's screen as if he could will her fingers to type something softer. Elaine asked Grant to explain why a document set described as marital conflict had entered a case about workplace conduct. Grant tried to push the conflict back onto me, suggesting that I had weaponized private information and created risk. Elaine did not argue with him. She asked a single follow-up that changed the room's gravity because it forced Grant to choose between two lies. She asked whether the documents were false or whether the documents were true but irrelevant. Grant hesitated half a beat too long, and that hesitation landed like a crack across glass. Elaine then pulled up the receipt confirmation image on her device and asked Mara to display it on the room screen for the record. The screen lit with a plain photo, a printed time, a merchant name, and a date that matched my account alert. Elaine asked Grant whether he disputed that the transaction occurred on the stated time and date. Grant tried to dodge again, claiming transactions can be misattributed and personal spending is not a workplace matter. Elaine responded that she was not evaluating romance. She was evaluating misuse of process and potential narrative manipulation tied to policy. She asked Mara to type one sentence into the minutes, evidence received and reviewed for policy relevance, and Mara typed it while I watched the words appear. Elaine moved to the calendar export next, the shared week view with one overlap circled, and she asked Grant to explain why the HR case had been initiated without resolving basic timeline inconsistencies. Grant tried to pivot to my party behavior, implying my delivery of divorce papers had been aggressive and humiliating. Elaine asked him whether the company had any policy granting HR authority to punish legal separation decisions made outside work. Grant said no, because he had to. Elaine then asked why his office had treated my calm documentation as a threat, and she asked it in the tone of someone who already suspects the answer. She placed Tess's one-sentence witness note on the table next, carefully, like she did not want fingerprints smearing it. Elaine stated that the witness requested anonymity beyond the case file, and that the observation would be treated as corroboration of timing, not as proof of intent. Grant's jaw tightened, and he finally made his most desperate move. He implied that I was targeting Lila through institutional channels, and he suggested a hostile environment claim could be filed against me. Elaine did not flinch. She asked him why Lila's written cover story, captured and photographed with date visible, contained details that changed across versions, and she asked why those versions contained repeated compliance language that matched HR phrasing. Grant looked at me, as if he expected me to erupt and save him by becoming the villain. I stayed still, because stillness is what denies a narrative oxygen. Elaine asked Mara to read back the last 3 lines of the minutes aloud, and Mara did. Neutral voice, clean words, no sympathy. Evidence received. Timeline inconsistency logged. Review opened under compliance scope. Then Elaine asked Grant to disclose any personal involvement with Lila that could constitute a conflict of interest, and she asked it as a required step, not as an accusation. Grant tried to smile through it, tried to call it inappropriate, tried to call it harassment by proxy, but Elaine repeated the request and added that refusal would be noted in the minutes as non-cooperation. Mara's cursor blinked on the screen like a metronome, waiting for a sentence that would become permanent. Grant's face tightened into something close to panic, and his fingers flexed once on the table as if he wanted to crush the paper in front of him. Elaine waited, silent, and the silence did what my shouting never would have done. It forced truth to either stand up or expose itself by refusing. Grant finally said he had nothing to disclose, and Elaine responded that the organization would treat that statement as formal for the record. She then slid a policy page forward, 1 paragraph highlighted, and stated that interference with an active compliance review and manipulation of case framing constituted misconduct subject to immediate action. Elaine looked at Mara and instructed her to type that a conflict of interest disclosure was requested and denied, and that the denial would be reviewed against the submitted timeline and corroborations. Mara typed it, and the words appeared on the screen while Grant watched them land like nails. Elaine then asked security to stand by outside the door while she placed Grant on administrative leave pending investigation, and she did it without raising her voice, because authority does not need volume. Grant opened his mouth to argue, then stopped, because the minutes were already alive, and the room was already recording him as the problem he had tried to make me. Elaine turned her gaze toward me last, and stated that my professional conduct in the meeting was noted as calm and cooperative, and that the organization would not tolerate retaliatory framing against an employee using lawful documentation. She then stated that Lila would be removed from any role connected to the case and placed under separate review for dishonesty tied to workplace representation, and that the company would coordinate any employment action through standard process. Grant's messenger bag sat beside him like a joke that had gone stale, and his face finally lost its smoothness. The door behind him opened a fraction, a shadow of security visible through the gap, and Mara's screen still showed the typed line that mattered most: refused to disclose. Denial entered into minutes, as Elaine slid the page protector sleeve across the table and told Grant to sign for receipt.